The gospel reading this morning comes from once again, the 14th chapter of Matthew, verses 22 through 33, found on page 16 of the Pew Bible. Listen to the word of God. Immediately, he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I don't know how many of you listen to country music, but I suspect you've all heard of Carrie Underwood. The song that launched her career is called "Jesus, Take the Wheel." Now, it wasn't her first song, but it's the one that got her noticed. It was written by Brett James with two of his best friends, Hillary Lindsey and Gordy Sampson. Now, James had written songs for other big artists as well. And I found out that he actually was killed with his family in a small plane crash last fall. But I watched a video where he talks about writing this particular song that they launched or pitched to Carrie Underwood after she won American Idol in the 4th season. And he talks about how it was kind of an idea that Gordy mentioned, that he'd heard some story about somebody losing control of a vehicle in ice. And they just kind of talked about it and set it aside and wrote some other songs. But then they came back to it, and they wrote this song. So I want to read some of the lyrics to you for those that are not familiar. She was driving last Friday on her way to Cincinnati on a snow-white Christmas Eve, going home to see her mama and her daddy with the baby in the back seat. 50 miles to go, and she was running low on faith and gasoline. It'd been a long, hard year. She had a lot on her mind, and she didn't pay attention. She was going way too fast. Before she knew it, she was spinning on a thin black sheet of glass. She saw both their lives flash before her eyes. She didn't even have time to cry. She was so scared. She threw her hands up in the air. "Jesus, take the wheel. Take it from my hands, 'cause I can't do this on my own. I'm letting go, so give me one more chance and save me from this road I'm on. Jesus, take the wheel." Now, I'm sure each person in this room could describe a time when we needed God to get us through, when we needed Jesus to take the wheel. And if you're like me, it's not a one-time event. Life is not easy. We get tested over and over again. Yesterday, I was at a gathering called Summer Oasis that was put on by a nonprofit called The Encouraging Place. And I've mentioned them before. It's the executive director is Reggie Edwards, and there are kind of three components to this nonprofit. One is assembling black and white folks to talk about things that they don't feel comfortable talking about in other places around racial reconciliation. The second one is this Summer Oasis, which used to be just for women, but it's expanded a little bit, and now they let at least a few men show up. And then the third one is a store around Christmas called Pride for Parents, where parents can go in and pay far below full price for Christmas presents for their children. But it gives people a sense that they have provided these gifts for their children. It's not just something that some agency, which is not a bad thing, but that someone else provided. But anyway, yesterday at the Summer Oasis program, Reggie started the sharing part asking for testimonies from people. And people talked about when God had shown up, when all else failed, when all other hope seemed to fail, and Jesus was there. There was one story about cancer that had shrunk. There was another story about actually it was her husband, talking about how he's been a school bus driver for 35 years. And there was some problem with the paperwork, and everything didn't go through to renew his commercial driver's license to drive the school bus. And he already had the routes memorized in his head, everything. He was ready to go, ready for school to start. And anyway, he went through all the steps that had to happen for this to actually occur and for him to get approved to be able to drive the school bus. And if all these things didn't fall into place, then he would have to wait 6 months before he could drive the school bus. And as most of us know, there's not an overabundance of school bus drivers available. But at the end of it, he said, "But God." And it was very obvious that God had a hand in making all of these pieces fall in line for this to occur. I have my own story that I won't give you all the details, but it involves an out-of-town trip, a family member's injury, hours in the emergency department, limited time to prepare for a funeral. And I remember saying, "Okay, God, I can't do this. You're going to have to take over." As I said, we could each share our story, and I hope there are opportunities that we can do that. We do get tested again and again. Whether you believe that the testing is something that is divinely caused, or whether you believe that God steps in when we are tested and assists. The testing does occur. And this is what today's passage is about. Jesus, the disciples are tested, and Jesus is in control. One thing I noticed looking at the passage this time was that 3 times the word immediately shows up. Now, Mark's the one that usually gets credit for using immediately all the time, and I can't quote the Greek for that phrase. Others might be able to. But it turns out that immediately is used throughout the New Testament. It's not just a Mark thing. And in this passage today, it shows up 3 times. And each time that the text says immediately, Jesus is taking care of the disciples. The first time it occurs in the first verse of the passage. Where it says, whatever it says about Jesus telling them to get in the boat. You can look it up yourself. But the word used, it's translated as Jesus made them get in the boat. But the Greek word is really a strong word that means that he compelled them to get in the boat. It wasn't really a voluntary thing. And the way I read the passage, it's that, and this, to remember, this passage occurs immediately after the feeding of the 5,000. That's what we heard about last week. And in all the versions of this story that occur in the New Testament, Matthew tells it, Mark tells it, and John tells a very brief version of it. It occurs right after the feeding of the 5,000. So here they've dealt with all these, probably more like 14,000 plus people. And Jesus tells the disciples, go on, I've got this, I'll clean up. And so they do. They get in the boat and they go off. Hopefully those of you that cook have had the experience where you cook and somebody else says, oh, get out of the kitchen, we'll clean up. Now maybe in this case you could say, well, Jesus cooked and cleaned up, but maybe it didn't take that much effort to multiply those loaves and fishes. I don't know. So the disciples are exhausted when they get in the boat. And the boat is battered by the waves. And that word that's translated battered really means tormented. And in ancient times, there was this belief that the ocean, the sea, was controlled by demonic forces, that this was a place where chaos reigned. Maybe even the place where Satan hangs out and causes trouble. Who knows? And I can just imagine that scene in the boat. They've been fighting against the wind, the big waves. I know one time I was paddleboarding, and Chris's sister and her husband have a place on the Intercoastal Waterway across from Emerald Isle. And so there's a stretch of water, and then there's this island, and then there's the Intercoastal. And so it's very calm in the stretch of water right in front of their house and on this side of the island. But then you get out in the Intercoastal, and it's not so calm. And I remember one time I got out there, and I was paddling and paddling and paddling and paddling. There was wind. It didn't seem like that much wind, but I was not moving. And ultimately, apparently they were watching me from the house, and Chris jumped in a boat and came out and rescued me. But I can just imagine that scene in the boat with the disciples. They're drenched. They might have blisters on their hands. They've been rowing and rowing, paddling, whatever, trying to fight this storm. They're scared to death. Are they ever going to get where they're trying to go? Sopping wet. They don't know if they're going to make it or not. And then they see something on the water that they don't at first know what it is. It could be, is this something else that we're going to have to deal with? They're thinking some new danger. It's early in the morning. It's the Greek says the fourth watch, which is supposedly between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So not surprisingly, they cry out in fear. And then we have the second occurrence of immediately. Jesus speaks to them, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And the words that are used are the same words that occur in the Old Testament when God says to Moses, "I am." When Moses asks, "Who do I say this is?" when he appears in the burning bush. So Jesus is claiming the authority that he has when he says, "It is I am." One commentator points out that when Jesus walks on the water, it makes it seem like nothing, that he is demonstrating that he is in control, that God has power over these demonic forces contained in the sea. And then we have Peter's request. Now this is the part that only Matthew tells, the version or the part of the story where Peter says, "Okay, if it's you, Jesus, command me to walk on water as well," which we could probably offer all kinds of thoughts about what hubris Peter has by asking this of Jesus, but that's not really the point in the story. But Peter wants to walk on the water too. And he does it for a little bit, and then he gets scared, and he starts to sink. We do things that we're scared of, and we're okay for a minute, but then we start thinking about it, and then we start to sink. Or maybe somebody else points out that you're actually doing this thing you're so scared of, and then you start to sink. And so then we have the third occasion of immediately. Peter cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and catches him. And then there's the statement, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" in verse 31. Now, traditionally, this has been seen as Jesus scolding Peter. I can hear in my own head the echoes of, "O ye of little faith," with a very scolding tone. But that's not what the commentaries reveal about this situation. The lesson is not, as one says, try harder. The lesson is not keep your eyes on Jesus, as though faith were primarily a matter of improved focus. The question instead that Jesus poses to Peter is more like a debriefing, like an after-action review, as it were. What happened? Why did you doubt? It's just a question. It's not a scolding. And of course, the answer is Peter, like all of us, is an imperfect human being. No matter how many times Jesus saves us, the next time we're tested, there's a good chance that doubt will show up. And we could also talk about where the source of that doubt comes from. But the good news in today's text, no matter how many times we doubt, Jesus is always there, whether it's in those dark nights of the soul or those scary daytime events. When we're being tested and at our lowest point, God is there, waiting for us to cry out for help. And God will immediately help us every single time. And our response is to worship God and talk about who this Jesus person is. And even with a little faith, we can do this much. Amen.